East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet. But there is neither east nor west, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. Schengen is at risk. The European project's final frontier is on the border of destruction. France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, Denmark and Slovenia have all introduced temporary border checks to deal with the surge in migrant and refugee flows. What are the political costs for Europe if Schengen fails?
Today you see across Europe that people are allowed to travel freely. I mean, students, workers cross the border every day to go to work in another country. So I think all these things will go down if we reintroduce borders at member state level and Schengen disappears. And I think that that's the real political cost, that the freedom of people will be largely diminished.
The political cost if Schengen fails is huge and immense. The whole idea of the European Union is to overcome borders, and it is so fundamental. It has changed people's lives over the decades that we have the Schengen area, and it would be really touching on the essence, on the raison d'être of the European Union if we were to touch Schengen.
Do you see the collapse of the European Union if the borders are reinstated?
I think that we already had a financial crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis. Now we are dealing with an identity crisis. None of the previous one disappeared, so we are still living with all the crises together. And I think we will not survive if we add to this crisis an identity crisis and bring nationalism and those issues to the center of the debate.
I come from a small member state, a small region, Flanders, so that open economy for us is hugely important. If we would shut down these borders, you would not only see migrants being stopped, but also trucks that have to be in our harbors. That's necessary for our economy. So the political cost and the economic cost would be huge.
1.7 million people in the Schengen area live in one country and earn their salary in another. They will be directly affected by the reintroduction of border controls. Waiting times on the border would make their commute more difficult and increase economic costs.
Central governments sit in the capital. Very often prime ministers and heads of state and government are not from border region. They often, I think, have no idea about what this really means for a border region. They might think, some small economic costs, but it's really disrupting whole economic regions. It's disrupting people's way to school, people's way to shops, to their job and everything. So this has a tremendous effect.
French government think tank France Strategy estimates the cost of reinstating border checks across Europe could rise to 110 billion euros by 2025. This would exceed the estimated trade benefits of the introduction of the euro.
French think tank also said 1% of the GDP, so I think it's a huge economic cost when we would reintroduce borders at member state level. You see, for example, in Belgium, my country, already the trucks today stopping at the French border, and this of course is a huge economic cost for our economy.
France Strategy says ending the Schengen Agreement, which allows passport-free travel between 26 European countries, would reduce bilateral trade by more than 10% within 10 years. Permanent borders will lead to a 3% tax on trade and a 10 to 20% decline in trade until 2026. Goods worth 2.8 trillion euros travelled within the Schengen area last year. The added costs will potentially cost transport companies 3 billion euros a year in lost revenues if permanent border restrictions return. On top of that, there are extra costs for the many personal and business trips in Europe. According to Eurostat, 200 million trips to another EU country take place per year, and more than 18 million trucks enter Germany every year via toll roads.
There's all these problems of goods being carried, for example, by lorries over borders that will now have to calculate a long waiting time. There's businesses who are, for example, setting up again in the Swedish-Danish border region that are now thinking of whether they should really do so.
EU leaders will soon decide whether to suspend the Schengen agreement, replacing it with a 2-year emergency system of border controls. Over 1.2 million migrants, mostly originating from the Middle East and Africa, made their way into Europe last year, almost doubling the figures for 2014. This has been Europe's largest flow of displaced people since World War II.
If you like it or dislike it, I like it, but if you dislike it even, you need to know that the future of our cities in whole of the European Union, including Central and Eastern Europe, will be a diverse one. So let's start working on that. And I think in some of these countries, they think they can stick with the past and they can stay monocultural, and that's not the case.
Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been a persistent critic of the EU's migration strategy. Hungary, which has seen the biggest movement of people on its borders since the Second World War, has been building a 25-mile razor wire fence along its southern border to deter refugee flows from Syria, Afghanistan and North Africa.
How can they say to us, we will not be with you when it comes to solving the refugee crisis, but they want us to be with them to solve their economical problems, to make sure that they get more democracy, and that comes along with a lot of money.
Orban has repeatedly warned Europe's southern border was defenceless against migrant flows. He criticised Greece for its failure to set up hotspots to register the hundreds of thousands of people that have arrived on its shores. Greece is now under serious pressure from the European Union and risks being cut off from the Schengen zone.
Greece will have 3 months to comply with Schengen regulations, and I think they will not be able to do that in the end. So it will open up a window for member states over the next 2 years to possibly close their borders. And on the one hand, you see a lot of pressure in doing that. People want to curb the migration stream into countries, but of course the economic cost will be huge. And I think that we have to find a political solution to keep open borders, to keep an open economy, and to keep our economy going.
What does that political solution look like?
I think the political solution to the migrant crisis is really to reinforce our outer borders, to really make clear commitments that it's a European problem that should be solved at the European level, to make clear agreements between countries, how many people can be harbored in the different member states, and of course also making sure that these people get integrated in our society and respect our core values. That are the 3 fundamental principles of a European migration policy.
A growing chorus of analysts observe that Russian President Vladimir Putin is accelerating migrant flows with sustained assaults on civilians in Syria. Putin's objective, they say, is to weaken or destroy the European Union and the NATO military alliance.
I am realistic enough to know that Russia is not in favor of a strong political European Union. And in that sense, the refugee crisis is driving us apart, not because of the refugees. These people have troubles enough, but it's because of the fact that we do not find a common solution. And in that sense, Russia, as a sort of side effect of what they're doing in the Middle East, it suits them. But I cannot imagine that that is a political agenda at its own.
This goes way beyond just a migration issue. This is a geopolitical issue. We've seen it not only in the declarations of Greece, but also in the actions of Turkey for the last months. For me, it is clear, if you want to be blackmailed, you will be blackmailed. And it is clear that Turkey is blackmailing Europe as we speak.
Unfortunately, everyone is using Syrian war to divide Europe and to put other issues on the table, like, for instance, NATO or other issues. That's the problem. United States is using Syrian war, Russia is using Syrian war, and European Union countries are using Syrian war. And meanwhile, people are losing their lives, and we are losing the European Union.
The Dutch government currently holds the presidency of the European Union. They have toughened the union's stance on migration and increased pressure on Greece.
Time to address this crisis is running out. We have to manage the situation better before spring, when large numbers of migrants are expected to take to the seas to reach Europe and possibly be killed on the road.
The Commission is working closely with both the Greek and Turkish authorities to scale up the returns to Turkey under the existing bilateral agreement, awaiting the full entry into force of EU-Turkey agreement.
The time for plans is behind us. What we need now is action. So we need to look at firm measures such as border returns, pushbacks of these boats. And then we also need to look at social measures. How will we be able to integrate, to activate people, asylum seekers, refugees who will obtain this residence status in Europe?
We need to tell people that we will not solve the refugee crisis. We will not solve the climate problems. We will not solve our economic problems by just go back to the member states and closing our borders. But I am optimistic. I do not believe that the EU will fall apart. I do think we will find solutions and we will move ahead. But moving ahead, that will mean that at the European level, we need other ways to deal with these problems in the future. So in the long run, we need to change our institutions.
As migrants are corralled along barbed wire fences and locked in detention centres with shades of barbarity, Europe is surrounded by burning rings of fire. If there is to be a positive and permanent outcome from the migration crisis, it will require a new commitment to a set of core European values, values which go further than an economic bottom line. For Europe to survive, our heart has got to be in it.